Vedic culture primarily focused on gods associated with elemental properties, including Indra, god of lightning and storms, and Agni, god of fire. Through the late centuries BCE, early Brahmanism responded to the challenge of Brahmanic movements, incorporating popular belief systems, philosophical schools, and even ideas from Brahmanic groups, such as vegetarianism and ahimsa. This transformation saw a turning away from these traditional Vedic gods and the incorporation of more popular belief systems. Following the Mauryan Empire and the emergence of the so-called Golden Age of Sanskrit literature under the northern Gupta Dynasty during the 3rd century BCE, there was a shift from the primacy of these Vedic gods towards the so-called Hindu Trinity: Brahma, the creator; Vishnu, the sustainer; and Shiva, the destroyer. In this episode, I will focus on Shaivism, the worship of Shiva as the supreme being, one of the 4 major religious traditions that emerged post the Brahminical Synthesis. I will primarily focus upon Shaivism as it existed in the late classical period, only briefly touching on the emergence of Tantra and Bhakti strands of Shaivism. The origins of the worship of Shiva are unclear and fiercely debated by scholars and believers alike. Some argue that seals discovered in Indus Valley civilization sites from as early as 2500 BCE represent a deity similar to Shiva, although it should be noted that this Indus Valley script remains undeciphered and as such claims are quite speculative. One of the Vedic gods was called Rudra, the roarer, who was associated with hunting and storms and shares many of the same characteristics with Shiva, and is originating from a time some time before the 1st millennium BCE. Although later Shaivites have claimed that Rudra is another name for Shiva, it is not explicitly linked in these texts. The worship of Shiva as a distinct practice is believed to have emerged sometime between 200 BCE to around about 100 CE, during the centuries following the collapse of the Mauryan Empire and the emergence of the Gupta Dynasty. Having discussed its roots, it's now appropriate to ask, who is Shiva? The name Shiva means auspicious one. He is known as the destroyer, the final aspect of the Hindu Trinity which annihilates the universe and prepares it for renewal. However, although this destructive aspect of his nature is important, he is also often known, represented, and worshipped as a benevolent deity who is all-knowing and lives an ascetic life on Mount Kailash in Tibet. Symbols associated with Shiva include his matted hair, from which the Ganges is supposed to flow, the serpent around his neck, a crescent moon worn on his head, the trident, or trishula, which is his weapon of choice, and the damaru, which is a double-sided drum. Another important icon of Shiva is Nandi, which is a white bull which serves as the mount and gate guard of Shiva. So important is Nandi as an icon within Shaivism that an image of the sacred bull on an orange background is recognized as the flag of Shaivism, particularly in Tamil communities. Despite these numerous icons and statues depicting Shiva, the most common form in which Shiva is worshipped is the Lingam, a phallic stone pillar or cylinder, often erected inside a yoni, a shallow sink with a single canal, which represents the feminine divine energy of Shakti, the female creative and sometimes destructive cosmic force. This mixture of female and male iconography deliberately evokes ideas of oneness and wholeness, and there is considerable overlap between Shaktism, being the worship of the female divine, and Shaivism. Since medieval times, many worshippers of Shiva, called Shaivites, have marked themselves with a tilaka, a ritual marking usually on the forehead. The Shaivite tilaka is called the tripundra, and is usually consisting of 3 horizontal lines on the forehead, usually with a dot made from sacred ash. The dot, called a bindu, represents the 3rd eye, a symbol which is often associated with statues and representations of Shiva. Tri means 3, and pundra means one which is released. The 3-fold lines have numerous meanings, including the 3 sacred fires, the 3 syllables of the Om, which is the sound symbolizing ultimate reality, and the 3 gunas, which comprise reality according to Samkhya cosmology. One of the earliest and most fertile periods of composition of texts relating to the major post-Brahminical traditions is the period under the Gupta Dynasty, which, as I mentioned before, has been traditionally regarded as a golden age for Sanskrit literature. This is around 320 to 500 CE. During this period, the Purana genre emerges. Purana means ancient or old, and the corpus of texts includes a huge collection of stories, myths, legends, and traditional tales, particularly dealing with gods, heroes, and demigods. These are smrti texts, meaning that which is remembered, and as such they are theoretically less definitive than shruti, that which is heard, texts such as Vedas and the Upanishads. However, in most Hindu traditions, Shaivite and otherwise, most practitioners have a better familiarity with Puranic texts as opposed to Vedic works. For Shaivism, the Shiva and Linga Purana are the most important of these texts. It is with the Puranic period that Shaivism began to take the shape with which we now associate the modern worship of Shiva. The popular worship, being numerically to this day the largest part of Shaivites, is drawn from this so-called Puranic tradition. Puranic Shaivism is theologically broad, incorporating sects which are both monistic in style, of the classical Vedanta, through to the dualists similar with the Samkhya school. Generally, this is the practice of those who pursue a more traditional householder-style life and involves worship at temples where Shiva is represented in both the lingam and statue form. Non-Puranic Shaivism emerged alongside Puranic Shaivism sometime in the 2nd century CE. Representing a much smaller subset of the Shaivite tradition, non-Puranic Shaivism rejects the popular myths of Shiva found in the Puranas and often chooses to worship Shiva only in an abstract form. These non-Puranic traditions embraced practices that had significant bleed with broader esoteric and tantric developments in Shaktism and towards the end of the first millennium, Vajrayana esoteric Buddhism. This non-Puranic tradition can be further broken down into two major sub-traditions, Atimarga and Mantramarga. The Atimarga branch of Shaivism focuses primarily on liberation and is favored by ascetics. They once represented the earliest non-Puranic tradition, with the Pashupata sect emerging around the 2nd century CE, their name derived from the Lord of Beasts. Their primary focus was on realizing a state of oneness with the godhead of Shiva, much like some aspects of Vedanta and Raja Yoga practice. The tradition encouraged the devout to abandon the 4-stage ashrama and instead embrace an austere existence of silent meditation, exile, hermitage, and finally death at a cremation ground. A particularly severe and distinct sect of Atimarga later developed, called Lakula. Later practitioners were also called Kapilika, literally skullmen, who would carry a skull bowl for begging and a skull-topped trident or staff. They would also wear a sacred thread made from human hair obtained from corpses and adorn themselves with ornaments made from human bones and ash from cremation grounds. It is also claimed that this sect engaged in rituals with blood, meat, alcohol, and sexual fluids. It is hard to tell exactly what is true about this sect due to the absence of primary sources within the tradition and the somewhat sensational accounts from contemporary visitors and writers. However, it does appear that this focus on death and traditionally polluting activities in a ritual context has more to do with tantric meditations on how human conventions create distinctions between ultimate reality of Brahman and the mundane physical and mundane world, rather than any sort of obsession with sex or other pleasure. The Atimarga tradition fell into decline in the late medieval period, although aspects of its teachings and practice would be absorbed into Mantramarga. Mantramarga either co-developed with Atimarga Shaivism or grew out of its early practices, with reality hotly debated between scholars and believers alike. This esoteric and popular tradition sought not just liberation, but also special powers, both in this life and the next. Mantramarga Shaivite authors compiled texts called the Shaiva Agamas, which deal with issues of cosmology, knowledge, philosophy, and practices of meditation and worship. Mantramarga Shaivism can yet again be subdivided into two major groups, Siddhantism and non-Siddhantism. Shaiva Siddhanta, which means literally the established doctrine of Shiva, is a tantric Shaiva tradition which emerges around the 5th century CE. Although it was originally practiced throughout the subcontinent, and some believe that it could have originated in Kashmir, it is nowadays associated primarily with Southern and Tamil movements. Siddhantism, as this is commonly known, is dualistic. Its view of the world is made up of three different parts, being Pati, the supreme being, Pashu, the individual soul or Atman, and Pasha, the tether of material existence. In this sense, Siddhantism is similar to Raja Yoga dualism as opposed to Samkhya dualism, which is much more anti-theistic. The individual Pashu is tethered by Pasha, but this is led on to moksha by Pati. In this regard, Shiva is generally worshipped in his manifestation as Sadashiva, the Divine Lord, the omnipotent Absolute. Nod Siddhanta Mantra Marga is generally focused on the worship of Shiva as Bhairava, the Annihilator, in stark opposition to Siddhantism and the worship of Sadashiva. There is huge variation in this side of Shaivism, but generally these sects have coalesced around Kashmir Shaivism, also known as Trika Shaivism, a non-dualist tradition which originated sometime after 850 current era. They do not recognize Shiva as distinct from the self, the so-called Pashupati divide. For Kashmiri or Trika Shaivites, the true goal is in recognizing oneself as Shiva, who, in this monistic model, is the entirety of the universe. I know that I have introduced a lot of different names and traditions under the heading of Shaivism, and this is partly to do with the fact that it is an extremely rich tradition. However, I will attempt to summarize with a quick flowchart. Shaivism first distinguishes itself from broader Brahminical traditions prior to the Gupta Dynasty. With the coming of the Gupta Dynasty, most Shaivite followers joined the popular Puranic tradition, worshipping Shiva in the large temples and in the form of human idols and Lingam. Around the 2nd century CE, non-Puranic traditions split off with a focus on esoteric and later tantric practices. The Atimarga traditions, which focused on moksha, probably emerged first with an ascetic focus and gave rise to this legendary but small Kapilikas tradition, although this branch of Shaivism dies off in the late medieval period. At the same time, or slightly later, the Mantramarga tradition branches off, focused on both moksha and supernatural powers. It emerges, splitting into different sects, some of which are dualistic, such as the Shaiva Siddhanta, who are dualistic and worship Shiva as Lord, and the Trika, or Kashmiri Shaivites, who are monistic and worship Shiva the Destroyer. Shaivism remains one of the major traditions within Hinduism around the world, whether that be in India, Nepal, Sri Lanka, or throughout the Hindu diaspora. It is a rich and varied tradition, ranging from householders to ascetics, monists to dualists. Shaivism was incredibly influential in Southeast Asia and to a lesser extent into Tibet and China, with some Shaivite texts and teachings being found in the Mogao caves in far western Gansu province in China. As with the other major post-Brahminical systems, I would caution against regarding the borders of Shaivism and other Indian religious traditions as solid. In Nepal, there is considerable bleed between Vajrayana Buddhism and Shaivism. Furthermore, internal to the Hindu tradition, there is particular blending between Shakti and Shaivite groups and their practices.